We'd like to give a little overview on our presentation. We're going to give a quick introduction of who the Central Pine Barrens Commission is, why we are working so diligently to implement prescribed fire in the Pine Barrens. So a little bit of the fire ecology and the fire history related to the Pine Barrens, why this program is important and needed, and then go over what's all involved in implementing prescribed fire so that you have a better understanding of the complexities and the planning and the actual operations to getting prescribed fire on the ground. And then we'll wrap up with the notifications and how you can become more informed of when we're doing operations and where, and then some of the different things that you can do on your own property to help your property and yourselves be more protected from wildfire. Okay, Bob? So the Central Pine Barrens Commission is a government entity that's funded through New York State. And we were established in 1993 with the finalization and the enactment of the Central Pine Barrens Protection Act. So the Central Pine Barrens was protected by the act of the legislature, recognizing of not only the important natural resources that are contained within this 106,000 acre area, but also recognizing the important cultural uses, the historic uses, our current agricultural uses, and then the vast opportunities for recreation. And holistically, the area is protected because it's a vital ecosystem. It's a threatened ecosystem and landscape, which is threatened due to development. So this enactment of the protection area was to guide land use and stewardship within the Central Pine Barrens to help ensure the protection of the ecosystem, of the landscape, of all those resources, but also predominantly to ensure that we have ample and clean sources of drinking water and surface waters. So many of you may know is that the Central Pine Barrens and Long Island all source their drinking water from our underground aquifers. And where the Central Pine Barrens is located here on the eastern side of Suffolk County is a deep recharge area for our drinking water. It's not only for our drinking water, but it's also for our rivers, which are the exposed aquifer, and then the waters that drain into the oceans and bays. In order for that water to continue to flow, it needs to be recharged from our rainfall and precipitation back into the ground, and also cleansed, which is facilitated by the natural ecosystem. And that is only facilitated if that ecosystem is thriving and diverse and functioning. So the land use and protection areas are broken down into the core preservation area. So the core preservation area is the dark area. This is mostly public lands, but also includes private lands where development is prohibited. And then the lighter green is the compatible growth areas. This is more of the privately owned lands with some public lands also interspersed within it. That development can occur as long as it's in compliance with our land use plan, as well as within the town zoning regulations. Go ahead, Bob. So the Central Pine Barrens itself, as I have alluded to in my last slide, is a globally rare ecosystem. It's found only in a certain area, as it's depicted here in this photo. It's found within the Atlantic, or within coastal sands in the Atlantic, from New Jersey through Long Island up to the islands of Massachusetts and the peninsula of Cape Cod. Within this system, there's a high number of endemic species. These are species that are only found within those ecosystems and nowhere else within the world. And then there's a unique complex of ecosystems and species assemblages. And in the middle, the ecological communities that are iconic to the Atlantic coastal plain and the Pine Barrens are shown here, as well as the number of rare species that they hold. So there's a high number of rare species that exist in these predominant Pine Barren systems. And I point out the pitch pine, pine oak, the maritime grassland, and especially the dwarf pine plains have a high number of rare species. They're also critically fire dependent ecosystems. So what makes our ecosystem fire dependent is that it's also a fire prone ecosystem. And that's due to our local environmental conditions. Our base layer, which supports us, is the very sandy spit of land that was deposited here by glaciers. And this very sandy soil has a very low layer of organic matter. The organic matter that is on these soils is very thin and is readily consumed because we have very low nutrients. It's also consumed by fire. So it's a self-perpetuating system where you have sandy soils that can't hold water, and then the organic matter that would otherwise be there is burned off, further reducing the environmental conditions that make for a very droughty, nutrient-poor system that is very flammable and prone to fire. So when you add in our topography, which is a very low grade, we have winds that come across and blow steadily. So you don't have the topography that's restricting these winds that further dries out the vegetation from our maritime climate. And then adding to the topography and winds is that if a fire does ignite, it's carried across the landscape by these steady winds. Is the species that inhabit these ecosystems need to be able to thrive. It's do or die, and you have to adapt to these very droughty conditions. And those adaptations also make the ecosystem very prone to fire because they're trying to minimize the loss of moisture from their leaves or needles. And so pines have very fine needles and high amounts of resin, and species that are broadleaf shrubs or like bayberry have very waxy leaves to help reduce the loss of moisture. Both of those make leaves and vegetation very prone to fire. So these are the natural conditions that support fire and carry fire in our landscape. I would add that as the vegetation senesces, whether it's each year or dies back to the ground, it builds up on the understory. And the way that this vegetation does this in our pine barren system is very different than it does in like a maple system, where the oak leaves curl when they dry. So that causes the understory or the ground vegetation and the duff to build up and be very open and further drying. So it doesn't dry out as much, or it dries out heavily. It doesn't hold the moisture as much. So that provides the oxygen and the drying conditions so when fire comes through, it's carried through the understory as well. So the key ecosystem benefits of fire, this transitions into what we're talking about is a fire-dependent ecosystem. As you have fire constantly being added into the system and being carried into the system, the species adapts over time and benefits from the fire and becomes dependent on the fire. So the reduction of fuels is very evident when you continuously burn, and that is advantageous to reducing wildfire risk. But it's also advantageous to reduce that organic matter. And that's where we get that self-perpetuating ecosystem of that xeric or droughty environment where you're burning off the organic matter, you're burning off the fuel, and you're opening up the soils and the habitat to allow species to come in, whether they're new species that are colonizing or the same species to set the next generation. You're providing the habitat for them to do that. While you're also the benefit is the reduction of disease and pests that are consumed over time within the ecosystem. The release of the nutrients through consumption of the vegetation is very important to helping to provide vigorous next generation plants that can produce a lot of fruits. And it also is important to help improve the health of the species that already exist there. And then for those species that have become so dependent on fire, that helps facilitate the next generation and the continuance of those fire adapted genes over time. So there's two different types of pitch pine. They're all the same species, but some have serotinous cones, which are closed. And that's a genetic adaptation to fire. And when fire comes through, those cones that have the serotiny, the waxy coating is burned off and dropped to the ground, and the next generation is able to recruit on that bare mineral soil with lots of nutrients. If fire doesn't come through there, then those individuals with those genetic adaptations are not able to continue to persist. And so the pitch pines that persist over time are the ones that release their seeds every year, regardless of whether there's fire. And if there is a large scale fire event, there's a higher propensity of the loss of those that open their cones every year as those that do not. So we're looking for a balance when we're looking at prescribed fire and wildfire of ensuring that we have both of those individual genetic representations of the pitch pine present to ensure that those adaptations continue with or without fire. And this fire activity also ensures critical habitat. So it doesn't just ensure critical habitat for the pitch pine and the different genetic variations within the population, but it also ensures critical habitat for especially many of the invertebrates. So the Atlantic coastal buck moth needs not only the scrub oak on which it forages and the tender new shoots that don't have the chemicals that are unpalatable to the buck moth, but it also needs these open bare areas of soil at which to pupate underground. And if fire isn't coming through to create those bare areas, it's not able to successfully to complete its life cycle and is exposed and very exposed to the elements and not able to complete its life cycle. And so overall, by providing the reduction of fuels and disease management and pest management and increasing nutrient availability, all of the benefits of fire is ensuring that this ecosystem continues to function. It continues to have all the species and the diversity that are contained within it and function and provide all those important ecological services. Next slide, Bob. So a little bit on the fire history in the Pine Barrens. So fire is a natural event that has occurred in the Pine Barrens since its inception, since it adapted and created and expanded on the landscape. And one of the driving forces has been lightning. It's not as prominent as out west, where you have lightning sparked fires from because of lack of rainfall. Here we have a lot of rainfall that comes with our thunder and lightning storms. So there's a higher propensity for lightning created wildfires to be put out in association with the rainfall, but it is still a prominent igniter of wildfires, especially in droughty conditions. And humans are the prominent carriers of wildfire and the use of fire in our landscape and have been for tens of thousands of years. We can't remove ourselves from the ecology as we like to do, especially in the Pine Barren ecosystems, because we are such a formidable force. And recognizing that is critically important to its management. So you see here that Native Americans have been using fire for tens of thousands of years to intentionally modify and improve the landscape for hunting grounds and home sites, and to have the benefit of increased forage caused after you put fire on the ground, where you have larger and more vigorous fruiting from blueberries, for example, that would otherwise then increase the health and viability and number of fauna by which to hunt. Europeans for 300 years managed using prescribed fire, but managed in a little different ways. They took the practices of Native Americans and modified that to their own benefit to improve pasture grasses and to improve areas for clearing and mass development. And then land managers like myself and Bob have been using prescribed fire up to date for the last 100 years or more to help maintain and mimic these natural processes to improve our ecosystems, to reduce that wildfire risk and help protect public safety. Other ways that fire has been ignited on the landscape is through arson or negligence. So the intentional setting of fire or the accidental, the throwing the cigarette out the window in a Pine Barrens ecosystem, especially in drought areas, or using a barbecue too close to the edge. All are ways in which fires are regularly lit in the Pine Barrens. A disturbing trend that we're trying to reverse and mitigate is the implications of fire suppression that came since the beginning of the 19th century, where as we continue to encroach and develop within the Pine Barren systems and across all of the eastern United States, we've been suppressing wildfire to protect our homes and landscapes. And the implication of that is that we're seeing actually an inadvertently increased risk of wildfire due to fuel loading that's not reducing those fuels that are building up, but also a decline in our forest and ecosystem health, as evidenced by southern pine beetle that arrived on Long Island in 2014. So our program is focused on trying to mitigate all of those different activities in order to provide the ecological benefits as well as the wildfire risk. So I'm going to turn it over to Bob, and he's going to continue on with the prescribed fire program and a little bit of the history.
All right. So as part of developing a big comprehensive fire management plan, prescribed fire management plan for the Central Pine Barrens, when I first got employed in the Pine Barrens, I did an analysis of the wildland fires that have occurred. Really, it was a study of a study, and just trying to use some GIS kind of work to make it a little more graphically visual. Many of us in Long Island think about the fires that occurred in 1995, the Sunrise Fire, the Rocky Point Fire, in late August of 1995, and everybody thinks that these were the ultimate fires that ever occurred in this ecosystem. The reality is, looking at a study that studied the fires on the ground since the 1930s, was done by a gentleman named Windich. He actually looked at all the aerial photos from the 1930s forward and mapped out exactly where fire scars were on the landscape. And you could see that from that, the largest fire we ever had here was right over here by the Brookhaven National Lab area, 1930 to 37. He doesn't know exactly when that was. It was 3,832 acres total. Second largest fire just west of the western edge of Rocky Point State Forest, to the west of area in areas now in Brookhaven that are those areas are no longer can even burn. They're developed. The Sunrise Fire of August 95, that was the third largest one we had. Fourth largest one was way over here in Southampton back in 1964, July of 64, almost 3,000 acres. But you can see that there's been a good history of these fires over the decades. What's more important is this chart on the right, I think, because this is about what's going on these days. If you look at the fire history in the Central Pine Barrens, wildfire history, you see that every decade, 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, each of those decades had multiple large fires. Now, a large fire in the national system is defined as a forest fire over 100 acres, right? Over 100 acres or greater. So you look here, in the 1980s, we had 13 fires in the 1980s that were larger than 100 acres. The thing that's kind of frightening, though, is that 1995, we had three. In the 1990s, we had three large scale fires, two of which were in August of 95. And since 1995, we've only had, so in the next decade, 2000s, 2010, we had one fire that was a large fire. That was the Oxbow Crescent Bow Fire. That was a little over 1,000 acres. And in the 2020 so far, none. So that it's kind of showing us that this is kind of inconsistent with fire history, that fuels are growing and accumulating, and that is creating a high risk for intense wildfires. And it's really out of whack with what's going on here in the fire-dependent ecosystem that Polly described. I'll just throw anecdotally over here in the Sarnoff Forest, right over here, you can look in a place that hasn't had fire in it in 100 years, and the scrub oak is like 13 feet tall. The pitch pines are kind of waiting in the scrub oak in there. So that fire history tells us, you can see as this curve dropped off, that there is a need for fire on the ground out there, and what can we do about it? So why prescribe fire? Well, managing fire with fire, we use fire to deprive. If we make fire in a place, it doesn't have the fuel for the next go around. Prescribed fire, here in the Central Pine Barrens, in this fire-prone habitat, it's not a question of whether it'll ever burn. It's going to be when it's going to burn. And it is going to burn. There's no question about that. And as you can see in the picture of this Crescent Boat Fire here, where it burned around the edge of this little estate here. But, the pitch pine forests, the pine oak forests that we have here, really want to burn in what we call stand replacement. It means they crown out. These are high intensity, high severity fires that move very quickly. And that's the nature of the beast in the pitch pines, their stand replacement. What do we look at here on the right-hand side of the screen? This is 1947. This is the area of around Curran's Field. You can see in this photo in 1947, Curran's Field, which is an 80-acre field, doesn't even exist yet, just starting to be agriculturally open. Here's Whiskey Road for those who anchor you in. Right up here is the old RCA Corporation transmission station there, and the fire breaks that were surrounding it. But if you look down here, this is you're looking at a prescribed burn that we call the south of Curran's Field Woodlands. It's 123 acres. It's got 13 units in it, 13 burn blocks. 60 of those acres have been treated. 60 of them have not been treated. But I want you to look at this and say, okay, in 1947, where we have laid out this prescribed burn, there's virtually nothing here but big pitch pine oak forests. By 1962, you start to see the beginning of some subdivision development coming in off of Middle Country Road here, coming up to the north. And you see different things going on up there at the RCA area. See a little more development starting to show up over in here. 1970, again, a little more agricultural development out here on the eastern side. A little bit more stuff coming in here in this Coventry Manor area south of Curran's Field. See, Curran's Field well established now. And by 1978, there's Coventry Manor subdivision that's established. There's another subdivision over here. I can't remember the name of it offhand. But these facilities have been pushed in. And mind you, there's been no fire here for many, many decades as of this aerial photo being taken. Let's go ahead a little bit, though. And if you look at aerial photo in 1980s, you could see subdivision was built here, as we said earlier, but we had a fire here, fire number 83, 237 acres in 1980 that burned to the edge of the subdivision that was being built at that time. And there were other fires over here, other associated fires throughout the nearby Pines area, Central Pine Barrens area. If you look at this photo, this is a 1994 photo. Here's Coventry Manor, it's built. Remember that fire had burned there in 1980, a few years earlier. 1993, you had a 32-acre fire that burned this little chunk of this area right here. And this is, of course, this is the 1995 Rocky Point fire. But for the purposes of the photo, this Rocky Point fire doesn't exist. This fire does, though. This fire burned in 1993. You go through a couple of years ahead, and on basically right on the fire scar of where it burned in 1993, a new subdivision is put in. So the point being here, if you look at this holistically, the subdivisions that are right in this area, they had fires on them in 1980 and 1990s and 1995. Even to the modern day, they had some fires over here to the east of them. But again, that question here of wildfire is not a matter of if, but when. It's going to burn in these Central Pine Barrens. So it's important that we start doing some activities that can help reduce. I have no idea where these lights came from, probably. Like some scrolling drawing on here, but let's talk about what's going on when wildfires do occur. Fire departments here, the fire departments are the ones that are in command of wildfire suppression. They are responsible for the fires that occur within their fire districts. And there are 16 fire districts within the Central Pine Barrens area. There's a high risk in suppressing wildfires, and we've had, if you talk to all the fire chiefs, they'll tell you that they'll recall the stories about the damages they've had to equipment and some of the really severe injuries they've had to their own firefighters. when we use prescribed fire, we reduce that firefighter risk because they don't have to be as aggressive in trying to fight the fire. It reduces the need for direct attack of wildfires, where they can have a little more indirect suppression methodology and not be right up against the burning fire itself, but by preparing in advance of the fire. It reduces the fuel hazards and fuel loading, and we make better site access when using the prescribed fires. And it really is an opportunity for different wildfire suppression tactics rather than just the straight direct suppression tactics that the structural fire departments all engage on. What do we get out of all this? Polly kind of hit on all these points in here. It maintains the unique species there. It reduces diseases and pests, increases nutrient space, light availability. Basically, it keeps the pine in the pine barrens. Is this something new? No, not at all. Polly already mentioned a little bit about the history of prescribed fire in the United States. Prescribed fire really didn't get kicked off. The U.S. Forest Service started doing some prescribed fire in the 1940s in Florida. Many years before then, pine plantations, private landowners were using prescribed fire, controlled burning underneath their pines to keep from shrubs, from understory, from development prior to 1940. 1958, the National Park Service, Everglades National Park, lit the first prescribed fire in the national park area. So it's been around a while. It's been around a while too for the Central Pine Barrens. This is a picture here in 1997 in Rocky Point State Forest when the first prescribed fire that was done there. And you know, many of those same things. If you look at this article from Newsday, 1997. I highlighted a few things in here. You know, such plant fires make it easier to fight wildfires in the long run, right? It's not a start of another sunrise fire, but a controlled burn intentionally set. People worry about the wildlife. And, you know, fire-adapted ecosystems are populated by fire-adapted animals. The wildlife is well adapted to wildland fires, or they wouldn't be there. They were there because of the wildfires. So the way we go about in the methodology of doing prescribed burns allows those animals to escape. We don't ring the fire. We progressively carry the fire across the landscape. So nothing new. I'd say there's a big one here that when we started to work and expand the program under the grant from the New York DEC, Central Pine Barrens Commission, really worked toward expanding the the landscape scale of how we were planning burning. So one of those factors was we broke this 106,000 acre Central Pine Barrens area into 5 fire management units. They were based on geographic boundaries. They're based on ecology. They're based on some fire history to an extent. The whole thing that we're doing was based upon, as Polly said, we were established in 1993. I believe it was 1995 comprehensive land use plan established there, laid the groundwork for prescribed fire. Central Pine Barrens fire management plan came about as part of the task force of the structural fire departments after the 1995 fires, and they identified in there the need to have more prescribed burning and a comprehensive prescribed fire management plan, which in January of 2021, the Central Pine Barrens, we published a comprehensive prescribed fire management plan. One of the things in doing this plan, and you can see here how we've broken the fire management areas to 5 fire management units. And then we really highlighted some of the places where we needed to do some prescribed burning and started laying out some pretty good sized projects. You know, we prioritize these areas, places that already had approved management plans allowing for prescribed burning. sites that had been manipulated with fire breaks or maybe had some vegetation or fuel thinning treatment. Really came to this term WUI protection. WUI means is an acronym for the Wildland Urban Interface. It's trying to do prescribed fire in the immediate neighborhoods of houses, subdivisions, and communities, infrastructure, transportation corridors that could be impacted by fires, so that if we can reduce the threat of wildfires in those areas, then we can maybe allow some of the fires, the wildfires that are out in the Pine Barrens to do their natural work without having to worry about loss to private or commercial property or government property for that matter, lives, transportation corridors. In saying that, we've developed some plans or developing plans in all 5 of the fire management units. And most of all these, once you look at these, they're showing pretty large acreage areas where we're going to be writing plans for or have written plans for. But the target is to be burning only portions of those areas. Those areas, every one of those little yellow blobs that you look at there, or the green blobs that you look at, are directly adjacent to private homes, commercial infrastructure, transportation corridors. So they're really focused on that. What we're planning to do in 2022, you can see down here, we are, for those of you in the Middle Island area here, we are really looking at expanding to doing our burning on this south of Currents Field. Here's our Currents Field, the 80-acre prescribed, the 80-acre old agricultural field there that's now a grassland prairie. You can see that we're planning through the fall of 2021, through fall of 2022 to be doing some prescribed burning in those areas. We do have 60 acres, I said, of areas that have been mechanically thinned and treated. It's kind of critical for us to burn in those areas prior to them being reinvaded by some of the species, the shrubs that have been thinned out. So we did our first prescribed burn in that area this past September here, September 27th, and we burned this unit right over in here, about 4-acre burn. So we're going to be doing some more burning there this spring and maybe next fall. When I say fall, I'm talking late summer, really, middle August through the end of September, say primarily. We are going to be burning a little bit over here in the demonstration forest in the Rocky Point area here. There's a couple little doodads right here you can hardly see. They're real small acreage. There's a total of 9 acres there in demonstration forest 1 that needs to be burned. And in Rocky Point State Forest grasslands, scattered grasslands that are throughout the Rocky Point State Forest, we're hoping to have some burns conducted in those areas. Brookhaven National Lab is a cooperative partner through an agreement with the Central Pine Barrens Commission. They are looking at doing some burning. They've been burning there since they burned in the early mid-2000s, and about 2017 or so they did some burning in here. So we're going to be working with them about trying to get some more burning there. And then we're also looking at starting this coming spring, carrying on through the fall, burning in what we call Sarnoff West. It's this area right in here that the plan's not been approved for yet, but it's about a 1,200-acre area there that broken into 23 burn blocks that we'll be working on. So that's what's planned. That's what's planned right now for the coming year. Those are the things that may affect you. How do we do all this stuff? How's the program set up? It's the commission's program here is led by folks like myself. I've been in wildland fire stuff for over 40 years. And I've been a prescribed fire boss on the federal level, national level since 1995. We are fully equipped and insured. We're building up our equipment inventory here now. We're working, everything that we're doing is done in a total collaborative environment with the interagency partners. Our process here, what we are doing is we are doing burn plan development because we have dedicated folks that can work on that, as opposed to the rangers who are conflicted with many responsibilities. They have a lot of balls to juggle. in doing their jobs, from law enforcement to search and rescue to emergency medical care to wildlife enforcement, the whole gamut of things. When are we doing this stuff? Our seasons are pretty much, depends on the March, but we just say sometimes starting the beginning of March, we may be able to get burning. Some years there's snow on the ground in early March, middle of March, even late March. We would be working through May 31st through the month of May. I'll say this is that during June and July, for the benefit of the northern long-eared bats that inhabit our forests here, that are species of concern, we do not burn during that period. That's when they're in their maternity phase and reproduction phase, and gathering, bringing their young flying around. But we would commence sometime in August, once that moratorium period of the bats is over, and potentially burn through October 31st, and maybe some occasional stuff in the winter, November months, January, depending on special projects or special needs. Most importantly, though, what I would really want to point out here is when these two pictures on the right-hand side. So here we are. This is in demonstration forest number 2 in Rocky Point State Forest. We burned this on May 3rd, 2021. We burned a, what was that? That was a, Polly, help me. I think that was a 5-acre unit. That was a, no, that was
2 3-acre unit.
That was a 3-acre. That's right. Those are all 3 acres, right? So we burned that 3-acre unit. That was one of the first forest burns that we had conducted here in a long time in the Central Pine Barrens. Look at this. This is May, June, July, August. 3 months later, this is the same spot, and you can see the kind of recovery that we had in the forest. You can kind of see what we're doing when we're doing our burns. We get some scorch. We might have individual trees flare up. We might even kill a tree or two. But by and large, you can see where the fire burned, but you can see the rapid response of the ecosystem to what we've done. It's there for their benefit. Burn plans, there's another slide coming up on what's in the burn plans. I just want to say here that, so qualified burn boss and burn preparation person will work on writing up these burn plans. We're using a national format. It's a standard format that's used for prescribed burns throughout this whole United States. It's in compliance with all New York State rules and regulations and laws. It's technically reviewed. If I'm the author of a burn plan for the Central Pine Barrens, we will send that out of our organization. For instance, the South of Kearns burn plan was reviewed by the fire management officer of Cape Cod National Seashore. Dave Crary was the expert who reviewed that burn plan before we sent it in for the technical aspects of the burn plan. And we in turn then have this reviews in the commission. Then it goes to New York State DEC Region 1, right over there. Stony Brook, their main office for the region, where wildlife biologists, forestry, and the forest ranger folks review that and give their nod to it. Then it goes up to Albany for final approval by directors. This is all done in compliance with the SECRA and Environmental Quality Review Act. We obtain any kind of permits that we need for any special situations or access. Writing the burn plans for a period of 10 years, writing them on a landscape scale basis. And here is the cover of that South of Kearns burn plan that I was talking about before. The old saying from my experience there is that if you don't have any monitoring program going on and you're not setting objectives that are based on resource achievements, and you're not monitoring that, then you're just a well-paid arsonist. Our program here is based on a scientific foundation. We monitor what is there beforehand. We go out and do the prescribed burn. We monitor what occurs afterward, and we look to see if we achieve what we're trying to do, and if not, we adapt and try to figure out what we need to do to make it better. I'll just say you can read through all those components of the plan that are on there on the left. I won't elaborate on all of them. I'll use this little graphic over here, though. This isn't really for us because it was written for another place, but it's a nice graphic because they say the season runs February through mid-March. Well, I told you here, we're just getting going. But when you're really doing a prescribed burn plan, you're figuring out where you want to burn, what you need to do, what are you trying to achieve on this, how are you going to ignite it, what weather conditions are safe to do such a burn. And we may do fires that prescribe burns that have a higher level of intensity or a low level of intensity. It all depends on what we're trying to achieve on the ground when we're doing our fire. And people usually ask, how do we contain it or put it out? And the bottom line about fire is that it takes three things. You got to have fuel, you got to have oxygen, and you have to have heat. And if you could take either one of those three things away from fire, it goes out. So if you are working off a roadway, a lake, a stream, a marsh, and the fire is burning to that, but the fuel that's there, because on the roadway there's no available fuel, it's barren of fuel, there's no fuel, fire goes out. If it's a marsh that's wet, fuels are too wet to burn, the fire goes out, they're unavailable. We'll create lines to do that. We'll do things like put in a hose lay with sprinklers on it, so we can use that as a buffer to control our fire edges. I'd say this is a day in the life of a prescribed burn, but you do your pre-work here where you might do some reduction or fuels, you might do some line preparation, develop some control lines for your fire containment. You'll have leadership on the day of the burn will you probably have anywhere from 7 to as many as 20 individuals with different apparatus that are out there on the fire. Everybody has specific duties and requirements of what they're doing. Pretty much the operations there, we start notifying our people a couple of days in advance. We're watching the weather in advance. The days before we do a burn, we will obtain a spot weather forecast from the National Weather Service right there in our Upton office there at the Brookhaven National Labs. They'll give us a custom forecast for that area for the next 48 hours. A day of, we're letting people know in advance that we are going to be burning in a particular location, and then on the day of, we'll be making those notifications, and we'll be using our equipment out there. It's a busy day, and then just because we're done, we mop up everything as much as we can before we're done on the day of ignition. But then we'll come back and monitor that fire every day. We'll continue to mop it up and make sure that it stays within its perimeter. I think that's pretty much. Oh, and then I just wanted to talk because I made mention of this earlier. So we're writing prescribed burn plans that cover some pretty wide areas of fire, pretty large scale areas. Yet we're not really looking at doing what we would call a broadcast burn. So here's south of Currents Field. Like I said, this is each one of these blocks is about 4 to 7 acres or so. This one's about 15 acres. This one's about 15 acres. But when we go in here and we start doing these burns, what we're looking at is doing a mosaic. We're not really looking at broadcast burning. If you're these homes over here and you look at this mosaic that we're putting on the landscape, if the homes are here and if a wildfire is coming from this direction in the northwest, and if we've burned out pockets in these prescribed burn blocks above here, we've reduced the fuels in those areas. When that fire comes across in here and it hits these discontinuity of fuels, a broken up continuity of fuels, the fuel continuity is broken up and it reduces the intensity of the fire, much easier to control, or even if it might not even cross this prescribed burn area and coming down by these houses and subdivisions. With that, I'll pass it on to Polly, and I was about to lose my voice anyway, so it's a good time.
Great, thanks, Bob. So just a couple things as we wrap up the presentation. Bob gave a great overview of the Prescribe Fire program itself. But some of the things that we're continuing to do outside of the Prescribe Fire program is to implement this education outreach program, which includes this presentation. This is one of the intentional efforts that we have in order to help increase people's awareness of the work that we're doing, the importance of the work, and also how we're doing it. And so, we want to make sure that all of you, the community, the public is aware as possible of all of these activities, and also being notified of these activities. So one of the ways that Bob discussed is through notifications as the day of, there'll be a reverse 911 call made to anyone that's in a defined area within the proximity of where the prescribed burn is happening. And that would be sent out through FRES, that's Suffolk County Fire Rescue and Emergency Services, who we have a cooperative partnership with that helps assist with these notifications. But outside of that, we are implementing these presentations for the notification process, but we'll also have notifications of where the operations are occurring on our Facebook page. So if you're interested in keeping up with us, you can like our Facebook page if you're on Facebook through the pound CPBC Fire. You can also go onto the Commission's website, and there is a mailing list. If you go to stay in touch, contact us, you can fill out your information on there. That will connect you to our database, put you in our database, and you can select which information that you would like to receive notifications on, reflective of the fire management unit that you live in. Or if you live in one fire management unit or work in another fire management unit, or you're just overall curious, you just click on the fire management units and the information that you're looking to receive. So if you're not interested in anything related to fire, just interested in the Pine Barrens, well, you would be added to our general information database. So those are two different ways that you can become more informed about our operations. And then in general, related to the Central Pine Barrens, you can visit our website. It's updated frequently. It's updated with our activities as well as the daily fire risk information. And then we have a separate page within our general website that talks all about prescribed fire operations. And you can visit that as well. It has our larger fire management plan on there. It has a wealth of other information. It has some videos about our prescribed fire program, the notifications, and the different aspects of the fire ecology and fire history. So those resources are up there for you, and I encourage you to access and use those, or contact us. Our contact information will be at the end of the presentation if you have any other questions. Some of the other ways that we're advancing our educational campaign is through press releases. So there was press releases that were put out in the Rocky Point Ridge and Manorville or Middle Island area for the prescribed burns that were done this past spring and fall. We've been meeting with all the fire departments in the area that we are conducting these burns, so they're all aware and informed and acknowledging of the operations that we're doing. And we'll be doing future meetings as we continue to expand our programs with those relevant fire departments in the vicinity of the areas. So for the areas in Sarnoff, we'll be meeting with those representative fire departments in the future to make them aware of our operations and ensure that there's mutual support and aid in that capacity as far as education and outreach and community awareness and response. We give presentations similar to this one, and we attend meetings, and then we also have tabling events that we participate in to help increase the awareness. Next slide, Bob. So the one thing that I wanted to end with is that all of the work that we're doing for prescribed fire activities is to help, not only benefit the ecology of the Pine Barrens, but predominantly to help reduce wildfire risk and ensure your public safety. And we can't do that alone. The money that the state is investing in us and that they invest in themselves to help reduce wildfire risk can only be strengthened by you taking proactive steps to help ensure that your fire is properly defended against wildfire as possible. And there's a wealth of resources that are out on the website, is listed here, or out on the web, that you can really tap into. And there's practices that you can implement on your landscape to help increase the defensible space against wildfire, but also to help resist ignitions. So many people think that the flaming front is actually what causes homes to burn down. Especially you see these homes that have been impacted by the fires out west. They have a very strong FireWise program because of the large scale impacts of wildfire. But those are not generally burnt down by the direct flaming front. They're consumed because sparks are thrown in front of the flaming front that catch leaves that are trapped in gutters, or ignite roofs, or blow onto decks. So there's a number of practices that you can implement on your home landscape and in your homes, especially if you're doing renovations, larger renovations, like repairing your roof or replacing your roof or your siding, or smaller activities that you can implement, like changing the screening, making sure your soffits and facets are secure, ensuring that leaves and debris are not blowing onto your porch, or that those sparks aren't blowing onto your porch by putting in fine metal mesh. So all of these resources that are provided here through the Commission's CommunityWise program, through the DEC's FireWise program, or DEC has the sponsored FireWise New York program. And then there's the National Fire Protection Association, that is the umbrella organization for all of the FireWise programs. They all provide assets on how to create that defensible space and mitigate those ignition opportunities from those flaming, the sparks that are being thrown by the fire. And then the last component that is really critical is that you also need to protect yourself, your family, your livestock. And to do that is through the Ready, Set, Go program, is creating a wildfire action plan. And that's being prepared for an evacuation, of making sure that you have everything organized, and how you're going to do that in the event that there is a wildfire, and how you can remove yourself, have what you need, similar to any other natural disaster, of being prepared, and how to remove yourself from that situation in a safe manner, along with your pets and your livestock. Next, Bob. So the Commission has done some extensive planning in the Ridge, Manorville, and Calverton area, creating this community wildfire protection plan. And within this yellow boundary is the areas that are covered within the community wildfire protection plan, we fondly call the CWPP. And this is an overall plan on how to reduce wildfire risk and protection. This is where a lot of the focus priorities for prescribed fire are being conducted, because this planning work has already been implemented, and that was an outgrowth of this plan. But also within this, the Commission had secured a U.S. Forest Service Cooperative Forestry Assistant Grant to help reduce wildfire risk reduction. And in that capacity, we got this grant in order to offer free wildfire prevention home assessments to any residents within this boundary. We'll come to your home for free under appointment, and we will assess the external components of your home and landscape and provide recommendations to help mitigate wildfire risk. It's all free. We'd provide a supplementary and summary report thereafter for you to use and refer to. And if there's any practices within that plan that are identified and you're willing to implement, you can receive up to $5,000 for this approved wildfire mitigation projects on your home landscape. So this is a limited time opportunity, and it is limited to those residents within this boundary under this grant. But there's all those other resources that I pinpoint for those that live outside of there to take your initiative to learn further about it, as well as those that live within to take that initiative too. The program that we offer is comprehensive, but it's not in totalitarian, I guess, totaling all of the wealth of resources that are already available on the web. So with that, Bob and I will open it up to questions. This is our contact information, and we can leave this slide up there so that you can write it down, or probably be easier to take a screenshot if you have that option. And so we'll open it up to questions. And if you have a question, if you just use the little raise your hand icon, and you can unmute yourself and ask the question. It was great. We're happy to be here, and thank you for the opportunity, and thank you all for your interaction and great questions that you had. And we hope that you can walk away with a little bit more knowledge and information about the Central Pine Barrens and who we are and why we're working so hard to protect them and what we're doing with our prescribed fire program. And hopefully that gives you some more awareness and a bit of peace of mind as we continue to advance the fire program.
Absolutely. That was very informative. Thank you, Bob. Thank you, Polly.
Oh, you're very welcome.
Thank you, everybody, for joining us
All right,
tonight.
good night, everybody.
Yeah. Have a good
Have
evening.
a good one.
Thank
Take care.